Hi listeners, welcome to my channel The Classic Audiobooks. This channel is for spreading interest of all listeners to books, that helps you to know about the books and writer as well. We always request you, if you like the audiobook after listening, you must have to buy that book and read for respect to writer and their hard work. After listening this part, please like the video if you like and share to your friends. And don't forget to get subscribed, click on bell button for future notification. And now don't skip, keep listening. The Classic Audiobooks presented The Glass Palace, Part 3 written by Amitav Ghosh. So let's start. Part 3. The king had not stepped out of the palace in 7 years. He had not left the vicinity of Mandalay in all his life. What were his preparations to be? One might as well try to prepare for a journey to the moon. The king knew the colonel well. Sladen had spent years in Mandalay as a British emissary and had often visited the palace. He was fluent in Burmese and had always shown himself to be correct in his manners, at times affable and even friendly. He needed more time. The king had told Sladen, a week, a few days. What could it matter now? The British had won and he had lost. What difference could a day or two make? The afternoon was well advanced when Colonel Sladen came walking up the path that led to the South Garden Palace, a pebbled trail that meandered between picturesque pools and goldfish-filled streams. The king stayed seated as Colonel Sladen approached. "How much time?" said the king. Sladen was in full dress uniform, with a sword hanging at his waist. He bowed regretfully. He had conferred at length with his commanding officer, he explained. The general had expressed his sympathy, but he had his orders and was bound by the responsibilities of his position. His Majesty must understand. Left to himself, he, Sladen, would have been glad to make accommodations, but the matter was not in his hands, nor anyone else's for that matter. How much time? Then, Sladen reached into his pocket and pulled out a gold watch. About 1 hour. 1 hour. But a guard of honor had already been formed at the palace gates. The king was being waited on. The news startled the king. "Which gate?" he inquired in alarm. Every part of the palace was charged with portents. The auspicious, ceremonial entrance faced east. It was through these gates that honored visitors came and departed. For years British envoys to Mandalay had been consigned to the humble West Gate. This was a grievance of long standing. Sladen had waged many battles with the palace over such fine points of protocol. Would he now seek to exact revenge by forcing the king to exit the palace by the West Gate? The king directed an apprehensive glance at the colonel and Sladen hastened to reassure the king. He was to be allowed to leave by the East Gate. In victory the British had decided to be generous. Sladen looked at his watch again. There was very little time now and a vitally important matter had yet to be settled, the question of the entourage that was to accompany the royal family into exile. While Sladen was conferring with the king, other British officers had been busy organizing a gathering in a nearby garden. A large number of palace functionaries had been summoned, including the queen's maids and all other servants still remaining on the grounds. King Dabao and Queen Supilot looked on as the colonel addressed their servants. The royal family was being sent into exile. The colonel told the assembled notables. They were to go to India, to a location that had yet to be decided on. The British government wished to provide them with an escort of attendants and advisors. The matter was to be settled by asking for volunteers. There was a silence when he finished, followed by an outburst of embarrassed coughs, a flurry of awkward throat clearings. Feet were shuffled. Heads lowered, nails examined. Mighty Wengis shot sidelong glances at powerful Wandoks. Haughty Myovans stared awkwardly at the grass. Many of the assembled courtiers had never had a home other than the palace. Never woken to a day whose hours were not ordered by the rising of the king. Never known a world that was not centered on the Ninaroof HTI of Burma's monarchs. All their lives they had been trained in the service of their master. But their training bound them to the king only so long as he embodied Burma and the sovereignty of the Burmese. They were neither the king's friends nor his confidants, and it was not in their power to lighten the weight of his crown. The burdens of kingship were the boss alone, solitude not the least among them. Sladen's appeal went unanswered. There were no volunteers. The king's gaze, that mark of favor once so eagerly sought, passed unchecked over the heads of his courtiers. The Bav remained impassive as he watched his most trusted servants averting their faces, awkwardly fingering the golden salo sashes that marked their rank. This is how power is eclipsed, in a moment of vivid realism, between the waning of one fantasy of governance and its replacement by the next. In an instant when the world springs free of its mooring of dreams and reveals itself to be girdled in the pathways of survival and self-preservation. The king said, "It does not matter who comes and who does not." He turned to Sladen. "But you must come with us, Sladen, as you are an old friend." "I regret this is impossible, Your Majesty," answered Sladen. "My duties will detain me here." The queen, standing behind the king's chair, directed one of her flinty glances at her husband. It was all very well for him to express fine sentiments. But it was she who was 8 months pregnant, and saddled moreover with the care of a colicky and difficult child. How was she to cope without servants and attendants? Who was going to calm the second princess when she had one of her raging tantrums? Her eyes scanned the assembly and settled on Dolly, who was sitting on her heels, braiding leaves of grass. Dolly looked up to see the queen glaring at her from her place on the pavilion balcony. She gave a cry and dropped the leaves. Had something happened? Was the princess crying? She jumped to her feet and hurried towards the pavilion, followed by Evelyn, Augusta and several of the others. Sladen breathed a sigh of relief as the girls came up the steps of the pavilion, some volunteers at last. "So you're going," he said as the girls hurried past, "just to make sure?" The girls stopped to stare, Evelyn smiled and Augusta began to laugh. Of course they were going. They were orphans. They alone of the palace retainers had nowhere else to go, no families, no other means of support. What could they do but go with the king and queen? Sladen glanced once again at the assembly of courtiers and palace servants. Was there no one else present who would accompany the king? A single shaky voice answered in the affirmative. It belonged to an official of advanced age, the Padin Wong. He would go if he could bring along his son. How much time left? Sladen looked at his watch. 10 minutes. Just 10 more minutes. The king led Sladen into the pavilion and unlocked a door. A wedge of light fanned into the darkened room, igniting a firefly display of gold. The world's richest gem mines lay in Burma, and many fine stones had passed into the possession of the ruling family. The king paused to run his hand over the jeweled case that held his most prized possession, the Gamauk ring, set with the greatest, most valuable ruby ever mined in Burma. His ancestors had collected jewelry and gemstones as an afterthought, a kind of amusement. It was with these trinkets that he would have to provide for himself and his family in exile. "Colonel Sladen, how is all this to be transported?" Sladen conferred quickly with his fellow officers. Everything would be taken care of, he reassured the king. The hoard would be transported under guard to the king's ship. But now it was time to leave. The guard of honor was waiting. The king walked out of the pavilion, flanked by Queen Supilot and her mother. Halfway down the meandering path, the queen turned to look back. The princesses were following a few paces behind with the maids. The girls were carrying their belongings in an assortment of boxes and bundles. Some had flowers in their hair, some were dressed in their brightest clothes. Dolly was walking beside Evelyn, who had the second princess on her hip. The two girls were giggling, oblivious, as though they were on their way to a festival. The procession passed slowly through the long corridors of the palace and across the mirrored walls of the Hall of Audience, past the shouldered guns of the Guard of Honor and the snapped-off salutes of the English officers. 2 carriages were waiting by the east gate. They were bullock carts. Yathas, the commonest vehicles on Mandalay's streets. The first of the carts had been fitted out with a ceremonial canopy. Just as he was about to step in, the king noticed that his canopy had 7 tiers, the number allotted to a nobleman, not the 9 due to a king. He paused to draw breath. So the well-spoken English colonels had had their revenge after all, given the knife of victory a final little twist. In his last encounter with his erstwhile subjects, he was to be publicly demoted like an errant schoolchild. Sladen had guessed right. This was, of all the affronts the Bav could have imagined, the most hurtful, the most egregious. The ox carts were small and there was not enough room for the maids. They followed on foot, a ragged little procession of 18 brightly dressed orphan girls carrying boxes and bundles. Several hundred British soldiers fell in beside the ox carts and the girls. They were heavily armed, prepared for trouble. The people of Mandalay were not expected to sit idly by while their king and queen were herded into exile. Reports had been heard of planned riots and demonstrations, of desperate attempts to free the royal family. The British High Command believed this to be potentially the most dangerous moment of the entire operation. Some of them had served in India, and an incident from the recent past weighed heavily on their minds. In the final days of the Indian uprising of 1857, Major Hodson had captured Bahadur Shah Zafar, the last of the Mughals, on the outskirts of Delhi. The blind and infirm old emperor had taken refuge in the tomb of his ancestor Humayun with two of his sons. When it came time for the major to escort the emperor and his sons back into the city, people had gathered in large numbers along the roadside. These crowds had grown more and more unruly, increasingly threatening. Finally, to keep the mob under control, the major had ordered the prince's execution. They had been pushed before the crowd, and their brains had been blown out in full public view. These events were no more than 28 years in the past, their memory freshly preserved in the conversation of messes and clubs. It was to be hoped that no such eventuality would present itself now, but if it did, it would not find King Dabo's escort unprepared. Mandalay had few thoroughfares that could accommodate a procession of this size. The ox carts rumbled slowly along the broader avenues, banking steeply around the right-angled corners. The city's streets, although straight, were narrow and unpaved. Their dirt surfaces were rutted with deep furrows left by the annual tilling of the monsoons. The ox carts' wheels were solid, carved from single blocks of wood. Their rigid frames seesawed wildly as they plowed over the troughs. The queen had to crouch over her swollen stomach to keep herself from being battered against the sides of the cart. Neither the soldiers nor their royal captives knew the way to the port. The procession soon lost its way in the geometrical maze of Mandalay's streets. It strayed off in the direction of the northern hills, and by the time the mistake was discovered, it was almost dark. The carts wound their way back by the light of oil-soaked torches. During the daylight hours, the townsfolk had been careful to keep away from the streets. They had watched the ox carts go by from windows and rooftops, at a safe distance from the soldiers and their bayonets. As dusk gathered, they began to trickle out of their homes, reassured by darkness. They attached themselves to the procession in small and scattered groups. Dolly looked very small when Rajkumar spotted her. She was walking beside a tall soldier with a small cloth bundle balanced on her head. Her face was grimy and her HTA was caked with dust. Rajkumar still had a few small things that he had found in the palace the night before. He went hurrying to a shop and exchanged them for a couple of handfuls of palm sugar sweets. He wrapped the sweets in a banana leaf and tied the packet with string. Sprinting back, he caught up with the procession as it was making its way out of the town. The British fleet was moored just a mile or so away, but it was dark now and the going was slow along the rough and uneven roads. With nightfall, thousands of Mandalay's residents came pouring out. They walked alongside the procession, keeping well away from the soldiers and their moving pools of torchlight. Rajkumar sprinted ahead and climbed into a tamarind tree. When the first ox cart came into view, he caught a glimpse of the king, just visible through the tiny window. He was sitting straight-backed, his eyes fixed ahead of him, his body swaying to the cart's lurching motion. Rajkumar worked his way slowly through the crowd until he was within a few feet of Dolly. He kept pace, watching the soldier who was marching beside her. The man turned his eyes away for a moment to exchange a word with someone behind him. Rajkumar saw his chance. He darted through to Dolly and pressed his banana leaf packet into her hand. "Take it," he hissed. "It's food." She stared at him in uncomprehending surprise. "It's the Kala boy from yesterday." Evelyn jogged her elbow. "Take it." Rajkumar raced back into the shadows. He was no more than 10 feet from Dolly, walking beside her, shrouded by the night. She picked the packet open and stared at the sweets. Then she held the packet up in her hands, offering it to the soldier who was marching beside her. The man smiled and shook his head in friendly refusal. Someone said something in English, and he laughed. Several of the girls laughed too, Dolly included. Rajkumar was astonished, even angry. What was Dolly doing? Why was she giving these hard-won tidbits to the very men who were leading her into captivity and exile? But then, slowly, his initial sense of betrayal turned to relief, even gratitude. Yes, of course, this was what one must do. Dolly was doing exactly what had to be done. What purpose would it serve for these girls to make a futile show of resentment? How could they succeed in defiance when the very army of the realm had succumbed? No? Better by far to wait, and in the meanwhile to smile. This way Dolly would live. Half a mile from the port, the soldiers formed a cordon across the road to hold the crowd back. People began to climb trees and gather on rooftops, looking for vantage points. Unexpectedly Rajkumar came upon Macho sitting on a tree stump. She was weeping and, between sobs, telling anyone who would listen the story of her encounter with the queen the night before. Rajkumar tried to console her by running a hand gently over her head. He had never seen an adult cry like this before. What was she weeping for? He glanced up, as though looking for an answer on the faces around him. It was not till then that he noticed that many others were crying too. He had been so intent on keeping pace with Dolly that he had paid little attention to the people around him. Now, looking on either side, he could see that every face was streaked with tears. Rajkumar recognized several people from the looting of the night before. He recalled how they had hacked at the furniture and dug up the floors. Now those very men and women were lying prostrate with grief, mourning the loss of their king and sobbing in what looked like inconsolable sorrow. Rajkumar was at a loss to understand this grief. He was, in a way, a feral creature, unaware that in certain places there exist invisible bonds linking people to one another through personifications of their commonality. In the Bengal of his birth those ties had been sundered by a century of conquest and no longer existed even as memory, beyond the ties of blood, friendship and immediate reciprocity. Rajkumar recognized no loyalties, no obligations and no limits on the compass of his right to provide for himself. He reserved his trust and affection for those who earned it by concrete example and proven goodwill. Once earned, his loyalty was given wholeheartedly, with none of those unspoken provisions with which people usually guard against betrayal. In this too he was not unlike a creature that had returned to the wild, but that there should exist a universe of loyalties that was unrelated to himself and his own immediate needs, this was very nearly incomprehensible. An anguished murmur ran through the crowd. The captives were moving, alighting from their ox carts, entering a ship. Rajkumar jumped quickly into the branches of a nearby tree. The river was far away and all he could see was a steamer and a line of tiny figures filing up a gangplank. It was impossible to tell the figures apart. Then the ship's lights went out and it disappeared into the darkness. Many thousands kept vigil through the night. The steamer's name was Turiya, the sun. At daybreak, when the skies lightened over the hills, it was gone. Chapter 5. After 5 days on the Irrawaddy, the Turiya slipped into the Rangoon River in the near darkness of late evening. It anchored at mid-river, a good distance from the city's busy dockside. At first light the next day the king went up on deck, carrying a pair of gilded binoculars. The glasses were of French manufacture, a prized heirloom that had once belonged to King Mindon. The old king had been much attached to the binoculars and had always carried them with him, even into his audience hall. It was a cold morning and an opaque fog had risen off the river. The king waited patiently for the sun to scorch away the mist. When it had thinned a little, he raised his glasses. Suddenly, there it was, the sight he had longed to see all his life. The towering mass of the Shri Dagon pagoda, larger even than he had imagined, its HTI thrusting skywards, floating on a bed of mist and fog, shining in the light of the dawn. He had worked on the HTI himself, helped with his own hands in the gilding of the spire, layering sheets of gold leaf upon each other. It was King Mindon who had had the HTI cast, in Mandalay. It had been sent down to the Shri Dagon in a royal barge. He, the Bab, had been a novice in the monastery then, and everybody, even the senior-most monks, had vied with each other for the honor of working on the HTI. The king lowered his binoculars to scan the city's waterfront. The instrument's rims welled over with a busy mass of things: walls, columns, carriages and hurrying people. The Bab had heard about Rangoon from his half-brother, the Thonzai prince. The town was founded by their ancestor Alongpe, but few members of their dynasty had ever been able to visit it. The British had seized the town before the Boer's birth, along with all of Burma's coastal provinces. It was then that the frontiers of the Burmese kingdom had been driven back, almost halfway up the Irrawaddy. Since then, the only members of the royal family who had been able to visit Rangoon were rebels and exiles, princes who had fallen out with the ruling powers in Mandalay. The Thonzai prince was one such. He had quarreled with old King Mindon and had fled downriver, taking refuge in the British-held city. Later the prince had been forgiven and had returned to Mandalay. In the palace he was besieged with questions. Everyone wanted to know about Rangoon. The Bab had been in his teens then, and he had listened spellbound as the prince described the ships that were to be seen on the Rangoon River. The Chinese junks and Arab dhows and Chittagong sampans and American clippers and British ships of the line. He had heard about the Strand and its great pillared mansions and buildings, its banks and hotels. About Godwin's Wharf and the warehouses and timber mills that lined Pasundong Creek, the wide streets and the milling crowds and the foreigners who thronged the public places, Englishmen, Koringhis, Tamils, Americans, Malays, Bengalis, Chinese. One of the stories the Thonzai prince used to tell was about Bahadur Shah Zafar, the last Mughal emperor. After the suppression of the uprising of 1857, the British had exiled the deposed emperor to Rangoon. He'd lived in a small house not far from the Shui Dagon. One night the prince had slipped off with a few of his friends and gone to look at the emperor's house. They'd found him sitting on his veranda, fingering his beads. He was blind and very old. The prince and his friends had meant to approach him, but at the last minute they had changed their minds. What could you say to such a man? There was a street in Rangoon, the prince had said, that was named after the old Emperor Mughal Street. Many Indians lived there. The prince had claimed that there were more Indians than Burmese in Rangoon. The British had brought them there, to work in the docks and mills, to pull rickshaws and empty the latrines. Apparently they couldn't find local people to do these jobs. And indeed, why would the Burmese do that kind of work? In Burma no one ever starved. Everyone knew how to read and write, and land was to be had for the asking. Why should they pull rickshaws and carry night soil? The king raised his glasses to his eyes and spotted several Indian faces along the waterfront. What vast, what incomprehensible power, to move people in such huge numbers from one place to another. Emperors, kings, farmers, dock workers, soldiers, coolies, policemen. Why this furious movement? People taken from one place to another, to pull rickshaws, to sit blind in exile. And where would his own people go, now that they were a part of this empire? It wouldn't suit them, all this moving about. They were not a portable people, the Burmese. He knew this very well, for himself. He had never wanted to go anywhere, yet here he was, on his way to India. He turned to go below deck again. He didn't like to be away from his cabin too long. Several of his valuables had disappeared, some of them on that very first day, when the English officers had been transporting them from the palace to the Turia. He had asked about the lost things, and the officers had stiffened and looked offended and talked of setting up a committee of inquiry. He had realized that for all their haughty ways and grand uniforms, they were not above some common thievery. The strange thing was that if only they'd asked, he'd gladly have gifted them some of his baubles. They would probably have received better things than those they'd taken. After all, what did they know about gemstones? Even his ruby ring was gone. The other things he didn't mind so much, they were just trinkets, but he grieved for the Gamauk. They should have left him the Gamauk. On arriving in Madras, King Dabab and his entourage were taken to the mansion that had been made over to them for the duration of their stay in the city. The house was large and luxurious, but there was something disconcerting about it. Perhaps it was the contingent of fierce-looking British soldiers standing at the gate, or perhaps it had something to do with the crowds of curious onlookers who gathered around its walls every day. Whatever it was, none of the girls felt at home there. Mr. Cox often urged the members of the household to step outside, to walk in the spacious, well-kept gardens. Mr. Cox was an English policeman who had accompanied them on their journey from Rangoon, and he spoke Burmese well. Dolly, Evelyn and Augusta dutifully walked around the house a few times, but they were always glad to be back indoors. Strange things began to happen. There was news from Mandalay that the royal elephant had died. The elephant was white and so greatly cherished that it was suckled on breast milk. Nursing mothers would stand before it and slip off their blouses. Everyone had known that the elephant would not long survive the fall of the dynasty, but who could have thought that it would die so soon? It seemed like a portent. The house was sunk in gloom. Unaccountably, the king developed a craving for pork. Soon he was consuming inordinate amounts of bacon and ham. One day he ate too much and fell sick. A doctor arrived with a leather bag and went stomping through the house in his boots. The girls had to follow behind him, swabbing the floor. No one slept that night. One morning Amitav Mata, the elderly woman who supervised the queen's nurses, ran outside and climbed into a tree. The queen sent the other nurses to persuade her to climb down. They spent an hour under the tree. Amitav Mata paid no attention. The queen called the nurses back and sent Dolly and the other girls to talk to Amitav Mata. The tree was a neem and its foliage was very dense. The girls stood around the trunk and looked up. Amitav Mata had wedged herself into a fog between two branches. "Come down," said the girls. "It's going to be dark soon." "No, why not? I was a squirrel in my last birth. I remember this tree. This is where I want to stay." Amitav Mata had a pot belly and warts on her face. "She looks more like a toad than a squirrel," Evelyn whispered. The girls screamed with laughter and ran back inside. Umongi, the interpreter, went out and shook his fist at her. The king was going to come down from his room, he said, and he was going to bring a stick to beat her with. At that Amitav Mata came scurrying down. She'd lived in the Mandalay palace for a very long time and was terrified of the king. Anyone could have told her that the last thing in the world the king was likely to do was to run out into the garden and beat her with a stick. He'd never once stepped out of the house in all the time they'd been in Madras. Towards the beginning of their stay he had once asked to visit the Madras Museum. This had taken Mr. Cox by surprise and he had said no, quite vehemently. After that, as though in protest, the king had refused to step out of the house. As he sat in his room with nothing to do, curious fancies began to enter the king's mind. He decided to have a huge gold plate made in preparation for the birth of his new child. The plate would weigh several pounds and it would be set with 150 of his most valuable rubies. To pay for the plate, he began to sell some of his possessions. The household's Tamil employees served as his emissaries. Some of these employees were spies, and Mr. Cox soon found out about the sales. He was furious. The king was wasting his wealth, he said. And what was more, he was being cheated. The servants were selling his things for a fraction of their value. This made the king even more secretive in his dealings. He handed Dolly and Evelyn expensive jewelry and asked them to arrange to have it sold. The result was that he got even lower prices. Inevitably the Englishmen found out through their spies. They declared that the king couldn't be trusted with money and enacted a law appropriating his family's most valuable properties. A mutinous quiet descended on the mansion. Dolly began to notice odd little changes in Evelyn and Augusta and her other friends. Their shikos became perfunctory. They began to complain about sore knees and refused to stay on all fours while waiting on the queen. Sometimes when she shouted at them they would scowl back at her. One night the queen woke up thirsty and found all her maids asleep beside her bed. She was so angry she threw a lamp at the wall and slapped Evelyn and Mary. Evelyn was very upset. She said to Dolly, "They can't hit us and beat us anymore. We don't have to stay if we don't want to." "How do you know?" Dolly said. "Mr. Cox told me. He said we were slaves in Mandalay but now we're free. But we're prisoners, aren't we?" "Not us," said Evelyn. "Only Min and Mabia," meaning the king and queen. Dolly thought about this for a while. And what about the princesses? Now it was Evelyn's turn to think. "Yes," she said at last, "the princesses are prisoners too." That settled the matter as far as Dolly was concerned. Where the princesses were, she would be too. She couldn't imagine what they would do without her. One morning a man arrived at the gate saying he'd come from Burma to take his wife back home. His wife was Tongsin Minthami, one of the Queen's favorite nurses. She had left her children behind in Burma and was terribly homesick. She decided to go back with her husband. This reminded everyone of the one thing they'd been trying to forget, which was that left to themselves they would all rather have gone home, that none of them was there because he or she wanted to be. The Queen began to worry that all her girls were going to leave, so she began to hand out gifts to her favorites. Dolly was one of the lucky ones, but neither Evelyn nor Augusta received anything. The two girls were furious at being passed over, and they began to make sarcastic comments within the Queen's hearing. The Queen spoke to the Padin Wong, and he took them into a locked room and beat them and pulled their hair. But this made the girls even more resentful. Next morning they refused to wait on the Queen. The Queen decided that the matter had passed beyond resolution. She summoned Mr. Cox and told him that she wanted to send 7 of the girls back to Burma. She would make do by hiring local servants. Once the Queen had decided on something, there was no question of persuading her to change her mind. The 7 girls left the next week. Evelyn, Augusta, Mary, Wathu, Nan Pao, Minlam, and even He Mao, who was, of all of them, the closest to Dolly in age. Dolly had always thought of them as her older sisters, her family. She knew she would never see them again. On the morning of their departure, she locked herself into a room and wouldn't come out, even to watch their carriage roll out of the gates. Yu Mongyi, the interpreter, took them to the port. When he came back, he said the girls had cried when they'd boarded the ship. A number of new servants were hired, men and women, all local people. Dolly was now one of the last remaining members of the original Mandalay contingent. It fell on her to teach the new staff the ways of the household. The new ayahs and maids came to Dolly when they wanted to know how things were done in the Mandalay palace. It was she who had to teach them how to shiko and how to move about the Queen's bedroom on their hands and knees. It was very hard at first, for she couldn't make herself understood. She would explain everything in the politest way, but they wouldn't understand, so she would shout louder and louder and they would become more and more frightened. They would start knocking things over, breaking chairs and upsetting tables. Slowly she learnt a few words of Tamil and Hindustani. It became a little easier to work with them then, but they still seemed strangely clumsy and inept. There were times when she couldn't help laughing, when she saw them trying out their shikos, for example, wiggling their elbows and straightening their saris. Or when she watched them lumbering around on their knees, huffing and puffing or getting themselves tangled in their clothes and falling flat on their faces. Dolly could never understand why they found it so hard to move about on their hands and knees. To her it seemed much easier than having to stand up every time you wanted to do something. It was much more restful this way. When you weren't doing anything in particular, you could relax with your weight on your heels. But the new ayahs seemed to think it impossibly hard. You could never trust them to carry a tray to the Queen. They would either spill everything as they tried to get across the room, or else they would creep along so slowly that it would take them half an hour to get from the door to her bed. The Queen would get very impatient, lying on her side and watching her glass of water move across the room as though it were being carried by a snail. Sometimes she would shout, and that would be worse still. The terrified ayah would fall over, tray and all, and the whole process would have to be resumed from the start. It would have been much easier, of course, if the Queen weren't so insistent on observing all the old Mandalay rules, the shikos, the crawling, but she wouldn't hear of any changes. She was the Queen of Burma, she said, and if she didn't insist on being treated properly, how could she expect anyone else to give her her due? One day Yu Mongyi caused a huge scandal. One of the Queen's nurses went into the nursery and found him on the floor with another nurse, his longi pulled up over his waist. Instead of scurrying off in shame, he turned on his discoverer and began to beat her. He chased her down the corridor and into the king's bedroom. The king was sitting at a table rolling a cheroot. Yu Mongyi lunged at the nurse as she went running in. She tripped and grabbed at the tablecloth. Everything flew into the air. There was tobacco everywhere. The king sneezed and went on sneezing for what seemed like hours. When he finally stopped, he was angrier than anyone had ever seen him before. This meant still more departures. With the head nurse thinking herself to be a squirrel and another gone home to Burma, the queen now had very few dependable nurses left. She decided to get an English midwife. Mr. Cox found one for her, a Mrs. Wright. She seemed pleasant and friendly enough, but her arrival led to other problems. She wouldn't shiko and she wouldn't go down on her hands and knees while waiting on the queen. The queen appealed to Mr. Cox, but the Englishman came out in support of Mrs. Wright. She could bow, he said, from the waist, but she needn't shiko and she certainly wouldn't crawl. She was an Englishwoman. The queen accepted this ruling, but it didn't endear Mrs. Wright to her. She began to rely more and more on a Burmese master who had somehow attached himself to the royal entourage. He was very good with his hands and was able to make the queen's pains go away. But the English doctor found out and made a huge fuss. He said that what the master was doing was an affront to medical science. He said that the man was touching Her Highness in unhealthy places. The queen decided he was mad and declared that she would not send the master away. The doctor retaliated by refusing to treat her anymore. Fortunately, the queen's labor was very short and the delivery quick and uncomplicated. The child was a girl, and she was named Asin Hatek Sumyatpaya. Everyone was nervous because they knew how badly the queen had wanted a boy, but the queen surprised them. She was glad. She said, a girl would be better able to bear the pain of exile. For a while Mandalay became a city of ghosts. After the British invasion, many of the king's soldiers escaped into the countryside with their weapons. They began to act on their own, staging attacks on the occupiers, sometimes materializing inside the city at night. The invaders responded by tightening their grip. There were roundups, executions, hangings. The sound of rifle fire echoed through the streets. People locked themselves into their homes and stayed away from the bazaars. Whole days went by when Macho had no call to light her cooking fire. One night Macho's stall was broken into. Between the two of them, Rajkumar and Macho succeeded in driving the intruders away. But considerable damage had already been caused. Lighting a lamp, Macho discovered that most of her pots, pans and utensils had been either stolen or destroyed. She let out a stricken wail. What am I to do? Where am I to go? Rajkumar squatted beside her. Why don't you talk to Sire John? He suggested. Perhaps he'll be able to help. Macho snorted in tearful disgust. Don't talk to me about Sire John. What's the use of a man who's never there when you need him? She began to sob, her hands covering her face. Tenderness welled up in Rajkumar. Don't cry, Macho. He ran his hands clumsily over her head, combing her curly hair with his nails. Stop, Macho. Stop. She blew her nose and straightened up. It's all right, she said gruffly. It's nothing. Fumbling in the darkness, she reached for his longi, leaning forward to wipe the tears from her face. Often before, Macho's bouts of tears had ended in this way, with her wiping her face on his thin cotton garment. But this time, as her fingers drew together the loose cloth, the chafing of the fabric produced a new effect on Rajkumar. He felt the kindling of a glow of heat deep within his body, and then, involuntarily, his pelvis thrust itself forward, towards her fingers. Just as she was closing her grip, unmindful of the intrusion, Macho drew a fistful of cloth languidly across her face, stroking her cheeks, patting the furrows around her mouth and dabbing the damp hollows of her eyes. Standing close beside her, Rajkumar swayed, swiveling his hips to keep pace with her hand. It was only when she was running the tip of the bunched cloth between her parted lips that the fabric betrayed him. Through the layered folds of cloth, now wet and clinging, she felt an unmistakable hardness touching on the soft corners of her mouth. She tightened her grip, suddenly alert, and gave the gathered cloth a probing pinch. Rajkumar gasped, arching his back. Oh, she grunted. Then, with a startling deftness, one of her hands flew to the knot of his longi and tugged it open. The other pushed him down on his knees. Parting her legs, she drew him, kneeling, towards her stool. Rajkumar's forehead was on her cheek now. The tip of his skinned nose thrust deep into the hollow beneath her jaw. He caught the odor of turmeric and onion welling up through the cleft between her breasts, and then a blinding whiteness flashed before his eyes and his head was pulled as far back as it could go, tugged by convulsions in his spine. Abruptly, she pushed him away with a yelp of disgust. What am I doing? She cried. What am I doing with this boy, this child, this half-wit Kala? Elbowing him aside, she clambered up her ladder and vanished into her room. It was a while before Rajkumar summoned the courage to say anything. Macho, he called up in a thin, shaking voice. Are you angry? No, came a bark from above. I'm not angry. I want you to forget Macho and go to sleep. You have your own future to think of. They never spoke of what happened that night. Over the next few days, Rajkumar saw very little of Macho. She would disappear early in the morning, returning only late at night. Then, one morning, Rajkumar woke up and knew that she was gone for good. Now, for the first time, he climbed the ladder that led up to her room. The only thing he found was a new blue longi, lying folded in the middle of the room. He knew that she'd left it for him. What was he to do now? Where was he to go? He'd assumed all along that he would eventually return to his sampan to join his shipmates. But now, thinking of his life on the boat, he knew he would not go back. He had seen too much in Mandalay and acquired too many new ambitions. During the last few weeks he thought often of what Saya John's son, Matthew, had said about the British invasion being provoked by teak. No detail could have been more precisely calculated to lodge in a mind like Rajkumar's, both curious and predatory. If the British were willing to go to war over a stand of trees, it could only be because they knew of some hidden wealth secreted within the forest. What exactly these riches were he didn't know, but it was clear that he would never find out except by seeing for himself. Even while pondering this, he was walking quickly, heading away from the bazaar. Now, looking around to take stock of where he was, he discovered that he had come to the whitewashed facade of a church. He decided to linger, walking past the church once and then again. He circled and waited, and sure enough, within the hour he spotted Saya John approaching the church, hand in hand with his son. Saya. Rajkumar, now, standing face to face with Saya John, Rajkumar found himself hanging his head in confusion. How was he to tell him about Macho when it was he himself who was responsible for the Saya's cuckolding? It was Saya John who spoke first. Has something happened to Macho? Rajkumar nodded. What is it? Has she gone? Yes, Saya. Saya John gave a long sigh, rolling his eyes heavenwards. Perhaps it's for the best, he said. I think it's a sign that the time has come for this sinner to turn celibate. Saya. Never mind. And what will you do now, Rajkumar? Go back to India in your boat? No, Saya. Rajkumar shook his head. I want to stay here, in Burma. And what will you do for a living? You said, Saya, that if I ever wanted a job I was to come to you. Saya. One morning the king read in the newspapers that the viceroy was coming to Madras. In a state of great excitement he sent for Mr. Cox. Is the viceroy going to call on us? He asked. Mr. Cox shook his head. Your Highness, I have not been informed of any such plan, but protocol demands it. The kings of Burma are the peers of such sovereigns as the kings of Siam and Cambodia and of the emperors of China and Japan. I regret, Your Highness, that it is probably too late to effect a change in the viceroy's itinerary, but we must see him, Mr. Cox. The viceroy's time has already been spoken for. I am sorry, but we wish to find out what the government plans to do with us. When we came here, we were told that this was not to be our permanent residence. We are eager to know where we are to live and when we are to go there. Mr. Cox went away and came back a few days later. Your Highness, he said, I am glad to be able to inform you that the matter of a permanent residence for you and your family has finally been resolved. Oh, said the king, and where is it to be? A place by the name of Ratnagiri. What? The king stared at him, nonplussed. Where is this place? Some 120 miles south of Bombay. An excellent place. With fine views of the sea. Fine views. The king sent for a map and asked Mr. Cox to show him where Ratnagiri was. Mr. Cox indicated a point somewhere between Bombay and Goa. The king was thoroughly alarmed to note that the place was too insignificant to be marked on the map. But we would rather be in a city, Mr. Cox, here in Madras, or Bombay, or Calcutta. What will we do in a small village? Ratnagiri is a district headquarters, Your Highness, not a village by any means. How long are we to remain there? When will we be allowed to return to Burma? Now it was Mr. Cox's turn to be nonplussed. It had not occurred to him that the king still harbored hopes of returning to Burma. Mr. Cox was a kindly man, in his gruff way. "Your Highness," he said in a quiet and gentle voice, "you must prepare yourself to be in Ratnagiri for some time, a considerable time, I fear. Perhaps forever." "Those were not my words," Mr. Cox scoffed. "Not at all. Those words were not mine. No, I must insist, they were not." The king rose to his feet abruptly and went to his room. He did not step out again for several days. They left Madras a month later on a steamer called the Clive. The voyage was very different this time around. They sailed along the coast with the shore really out of sight. They went through the Palk Strait, with the northern tip of Ceylon visible on the left and the southernmost point in India, Cape Comorin, in view on the right. 4 days after leaving Madras, the Clive nosed into a wide and sunlit bay. There were cliffs at either end of the bay, a sweeping beach and a meandering river. The town was on a hill above the bay. It was so thickly blanketed with coconut palms that very little could be seen of it. They spent the night on the steamer and went ashore the next morning. The Clive pulled in beside a jetty that reached a long way out into the shallow bay. Carriages were waiting for them at the far end, near a fishing village. The king was greeted with a gun salute and a guard of honor. Then the carriages set off in single file down a narrow, tree-shaded path. There were red-tiled houses on either side, with gardens of mango trees and areca palms. There were policemen everywhere, holding back the people who'd gathered to watch. They passed a bazaar and a grey-walled jail and a line of police barracks. The road ended at a large, 2-storied bungalow set inside a walled garden. It was on a bluff above the town, overlooking the bay. It was called Outram House. The king went in first and climbed slowly up the stairs. He came to a large bedroom and went inside. The room was furnished with a desk, a bed and 3 armchairs. It opened onto a small balcony that faced westwards towards the sea. The king walked very slowly around the rooms. He toyed with the slatted wooden shutters, scratched at a rosette of candle wax and ran a finger over a half-effaced mark on the wall, crumbling the flaking plaster between finger and thumb. There was a faintly musty smell in the room and a tracing of mildew on the wall. He tried to mark these things in his memory, for he knew they would fade in time and a day would come when he would want to remember them: the vividness of his first encounter with the site of his captivity, the sour mildewed smell of it and the roughness of its texture upon the skin. Downstairs Dolly was running across the garden with the first princess, chasing a lizard of a bright red color. This was different from the mansion in Madras, much smaller but more welcoming. Here one could run and play hide and seek between the trunks of leaning coconut palms. She came to a mango tree whose branches reached all the way up to a window on the top floor of the bungalow. Perhaps that would be her room. Her window, with twigs scratching against the glass. A bell began to ring in a temple, somewhere in the town below. She stopped to listen, looking down the slope of the garden, across the canopy of coconut fronds, towards the wide sparkling bay. She could smell drying fish and incense. How bright it was, how peaceful. Everything seemed so safe here, behind these high stone walls. The king heard the bells too. He stepped out onto the balcony of the upstairs bedroom. The whole town lay spread out below, framed by the sweep of the bay and the 2 steep promontories on either side. The view was magnificent, just as Mr. Cox had said. He went back into the bedroom. He sat in one of the armchairs and watched the ghostly shadows of coconut palms swaying on the room's white plaster walls. In this room the hours would accumulate like grains of sand until they buried him. Next part of this books will be released in next episode. Thanks for listening, dear friends.